Thank you very much, Jane, for that nice introduction. And welcome to everybody here for this last session today. Thank you very much for coming. And as you already know from Jane's introduction, I'm not a librarian. I don't work in a library, but Catalyst IT is involved in developing a library management system. We usually only work with open source software. So we have Koha as integrated library management system. And my particular interests, as you can see from my t-shirt, are Mahara and Moodle. Moodle is a learning management system and Mahara an e-portfolio system. But I'm also involved with the Koha team because when we look at educational context, usually schools or universities don't just need one system, but we need to look at the entire context. And so also, how can we actually combine these different systems? How can we integrate them? How can we harness things that we've already put into one system and reuse them into another system? And that's also things that we are looking at, how we can integrate multiple different systems that are being used by our clients or also by other institutions. But today I'm not going to talk about Koha, Moodle, or Mahara, but about an initiative that was started earlier this year, and namely after the earthquakes in the Canterbury region in September, but then primarily after the earthquake in February on the 22nd, there were a lot of things that left schools in a very difficult position. Namely, teachers lost their computers. So suddenly, years and years, sometimes decades of preparation of curricula were lost. There were no printed handouts available anymore. School servers, where schools who already had digital content that they had the teachers prepare, were also not accessible. They were either dead or not recoverable. So all that content was gone as well. And then, of course, schools were closed. So even if a school still had material available, the teachers and the students couldn't go back to school in order to resume their classes. And then also looking at a more librarian side, books were not available anymore. Maybe they were just buried under rubble, or they couldn't be used anymore because they were wet or just dirty, so that they couldn't be put into a classroom safely. But taking all that into consideration, schools still had to go on. Kids still had to study to keep up with their fellow students at other schools around the country, and also especially in high school, students needed to take their NCAA exams. So how do you do that in a school that virtually either doesn't exist anymore or that can't be really in session in reality because the school building doesn't exist? So the Ministry of Education, in particular the Managed Learning Environment Project Group around Paul Seiler, had several ideas of how to help these schools. Because the goal of one of the tasks for the Managed Learning Environment Project Group was to assist schools in integrating technology in their classroom. So managed learning environment, how to set up a learning management system, how to integrate it with a student management system, how to bring in e-portfolios, how to bring in other Web 2.0 tools, and all these things so that the schools could use technology. And so one idea amongst the many, many that Paul Seiler and his team had for assisting Canterbury schools was to set up an educational resources repository so that teachers could assist other teachers from the North Island or basically all the way outside of the Canterbury region, assist teachers in Canterbury to give them teaching material so that they could start again and don't have to start at ground zero, but that they could already have certain material available which they could then expand on. And the particular focus there in the beginning stages of the project, which we started at the beginning of March, was to especially assist high school teachers so that the kids who were going to have to take NCAA exams could actually continue with their studies. So that was the first focus, but of course also assisting intermediate or primary schools then also became part of the project. Excuse me, please. Another important thing in the project was that the resources that schools in Canterbury got were not supposed to be housed on just one single server in a school, but somewhere for teachers in the cloud so that they could be accessed from anywhere. And then also when there was a problem again in an earthquake region or where any other natural catastrophe could be, that these were then still available to the teachers and later on also to students. Another component that we needed to take into account was that, of course, it could only be complementary, because teachers in New Zealand were already using a lot of online resources in their teaching. Wiki Educator is being used around the country. Teachers use VoiceThread, they use Prezi presentations, they use online games and all these things. There is Super Club Plus for primary school kids that talks about net safety, but that can be incorporated into the classroom. And all these things already exist. So we were not supposed, and we didn't want to replace them all and say something, now we have this resource repository and that's the ultimate thing. But what we wanted to was kind of to provide another service that stepped into where there were gaps so that everything could again become one big resource pool that the teachers could choose from. What we can do in the resource repository is to include links to other websites, so teachers don't necessarily always have to upload files, but they could also link to other files. And what was also a vision was to pull in freely available books online, for example, from Project Gutenberg that were out of copyright, so that also some actual books that the students needed to work with could be replaced. For example, Shakespeare or Dickens or anything, especially in the English language, that was available. Then we had quite a bit of a discussion around open educational resources. Because when you put something online, how do you make it available? Do you put a Creative Commons license on it? Do you have it under copyright? When teachers upload resources, do they have to check all these things first? And so in the beginning, there were a few schools who were happy to contribute material to the Canterbury schools, but not make them freely available, simply for competition purposes, competing with other schools in New Zealand. So if a neighboring school also saw how they're actually teaching in their classroom, then they might have gotten that material. And that is just something where we said, well, sure, we could look into this, but it would be a very big administrative burden trying to find a way to identify each teacher within New Zealand and then say, okay, he or she teaches at a Canterbury school and now they have access to that material, but the other teachers don't. And so in the end, also being in a company that works with open source software that also looks into how to make things open, and the Emily Project Group also being quite invested into contributing the development work that we do to the open source projects, we decided to go with open educational resources. And that means whenever somebody puts something into the repository, they can choose a Creative Commons license. They could also choose regular copyright, but then of course makes it more difficult for other people to use the resource. But they always have to make sure that they do not include material that they have not created themselves, where there might be some copyright infringement from others. But in the end, through the use or through that step, we could actually make that site open to anybody. So nobody really has to log in order to provide resources, and nobody has to log in order to view them and to download them. So once we had sorted out all these questions, we established www.resources.school.nz. And it's an extremely simple site. It basically only consists of 2 pages. The first one is where you create a resource that you want to share with others. And on here, you already see that you can provide some information about the resource. Unfortunately, I think it might be a bit difficult to read through the distance here. But what you do is similar to what you do in a library catalog. You provide the title, you provide the year level. Then you can also put in a subject area, a learning area, and then also, for example, the NZEA level, and also which language that resource is in, whether it's a lesson plan, an image, a map. So you can basically add a lot of metadata to it. Then when you go to the other page, which is the browse page, you can then search for all these categories for that metadata. And for example, if you just put in biology, then you get everything on biology. Or if you wanted to limit it, you could also put in a year level. And then you get the actual resource. You have the classification there, so the metadata, and also the files that you can then download. So there's nothing stopping anybody from doing that immediately, so no registration necessary. Now you might ask, what sets this resource repository actually apart to the other things that you already know, digital libraries, what you're doing in libraries, what schools are doing, what WikiEducator does, and so on. There are just a few things to mention, namely in contrast to other Web 2.0 repositories that are out, that are available. What we have included here is the TKI metadata. So all these areas here that you see are metadata fields that the Ministry of Education, the Managed Learning Environment Group, has identified as being very useful for identifying teaching resources in New Zealand. And so we are using these same metadata fields are also being used by KnowledgeNet and also by Ultranet for the metadata project from the Ministry of Education, and eventually then also so being fed into Digital NZ. Because the Ministry of Education with the Metadata project also wants to make all these resources available freely for all New Zealanders. And so what can be done is that they are basically indexed in Digital NZ using all these metadata fields. So that could then also be done with this content, so that eventually in the future you could find the content via Digital NZ and wouldn't actually even have to go to the repository.
Question.
Sure.
Is there a way to actually obtain that metadata list, like a table of what is recommended by the Ministry of Education?
We have included all the important metadata fields in here that should be used by the ministry. There are a few more, I think, that we have left out. For example, the Scott thesaurus, because when we initiated the project, there was still the debate whether the ministry could actually use the thesaurus for search terms or not. So there are a few things that are left out, but most of them are implemented in there. So these are the things that set them apart from other Web 2.0 repositories. In contrast to TKI, what you might know, which is also a huge website with resources for schools, the content is not moderated on the resource repository. So you may think, how can that be an advantage? The advantage is that any teacher can upload their content, what they are doing in the classroom, so it doesn't have to go through the moderation queue where some other person decides, actually, I don't like this lesson plan because it doesn't follow standard XYZ to the dot. But the teacher who has been using it for 2 or 3 terms or even longer knows that it works like this, so they can still put it in the resource repository. So that also means that the resources can be shared much more quickly than if somebody from TKI first had to go through all of that. And the aspect of quick was also one aspect why the Ministry of Education, the MLE group, decided not to go with TKI or any other ministry project until then, because it would have taken much longer to put resources in and make them available to the schools. Here, when you upload a file, it's basically there half a minute later or a minute later, depending on how many metadata fields you put in. And we do not require all fields. So basically just a title, the author would always have to be there, and then also the year level or the subject area are required, and all the other metadata is optional and can then be added if needed.
Is there a provision for peer review within the repository?
Thanks for that question, Penny. Not at this moment, but that was something that we could expand if the project continues. For example, that you also have star ratings on it. You can comment on the resources. You can also upload additional resources. For example, if a teacher put a lesson plan forward and you have an alternative approach to the same standard, these are all things that could be added. Yeah.
Can I just clarify when you're talking about this in terms of metadata, etc.? Are you referring to secondary or are you referring to primary and intermediate?
We've implemented the metadata for both. It started out with so that you could put in NCAA levels and subject areas, but then we received feedback from an intermediate school that they could not really work with these terms, and that's why we implemented also learning areas. And that's why we also cannot force too many fields, because secondary schools have different needs than primary, so therefore only a very few fields are actually mandatory in there. Now I've been talking quite a bit in the past, in the present, so kind of we did, and this resource repository is available because when we started the project back in early March, we finished the implementation of it in April, and throughout April the Ministry of Education still supported it, but then at some point it was not in its plan anymore, and therefore we at Catalyst have been continuing because we thought it was a very good initiative that was started, and we still wanted to make these resources available. At the moment, I think we have approximately 80 resources, which does not sound a whole lot, but altogether that is multiple gigabytes actually of resources, because one resource can be an entire unit standard. It doesn't just have to be one file or two files, but oftentimes what we did so that we could actually upload a lot of resources at once, the teachers who contributed put everything in one big folder for one unit standard. So for some we have 5 or 10 different files, so that a teacher in Christchurch could take that entire unit standard and have the entire lesson plan, and not just have piecemeal.
Excuse me, can I ask, how did you advertise it between schools so that other schools knew that they could do it?
We advertised it on the MLE group, which is a Google group used by interested schools around New Zealand, where all the ICT interested people are on it. We also advertised it through the Ministry of Education, so the ministry itself did advertisement. The Greater Christchurch School Network knew about it, and several schools were also asked directly to contribute. And because the ministry also wanted to start out with schools where they knew that that they have very good results for NCAA, and ask those first, and kind of do it more through direct advertisement than an entire spam campaign. What we could not implement, unfortunately, was that librarians or school librarians cataloged the resources. That was one component in the beginning that the ministry was very keen on doing, so that librarians in the Canterbury region who were not able to continue their current job at that time but could still use the internet could actually catalog some of these resources, because so that teachers would only have to put in the very crucial information, and then because a lot of cataloger librarians know how to catalog things, could then take over and put in keywords or add more metadata so that we actually get full resource materials. That unfortunately never came through because of the vanishing ministry support at some time, and we from our end, from Catalyst, were not able to then find the volunteers to do that. So one thing, in order to sustain the resources repository, would be that their libraries or a school or several, a combination of libraries got together and assisted with the cataloging of the resources that are already there, and also encourage the users that are in that school or in the public library that librarians know to contribute further to the repository to let it grow. We of course also know that it or usually a website does not grow from 0 to 100 within a very short time, and that usually there is a lot of interaction still needed, and lots of follow-up and direct encouragement of people, and at the moment we were not able to do that. And also we don't have these contacts so much with the schools where we know we can immediately ask librarian XYZ, or we can go to the school and they already have procedures set up in order to share resources, because they already do that within their school anyway. So in a way, the resources repository right now is in limbo. It still exists. People are still downloading resources, but there hasn't been too many contributions over the last few months. But if you as librarian community find it interesting also to build up a digital library for resources that are used in New Zealand schools, then that could be a project to expand on from what we currently have and see where it could be taken in the future. And if you have any further questions, then I'm happy to answer them now within the next 15 minutes that we still have. Or you can also drop me an email or go to our website and find out more about it.